Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Beat the Big Guys. I'm Sandy Rosenthal, your host. And today we have a guest who is going to be our season opener of the fifth season of Beat the Big Guys. And her name is Michelle Johnston. Hello, Michelle.
Hey, Sandy. Thank you so much for having me.
You're so welcome. I've read your book. I learned so much about it, and I am going to tell our listeners all about your book and a little bit about you right now. My guest is Dr. Michelle Johnston. She's Gaston Chair of Business at Loyola University's New Orleans College of Business. Dr. Johnston is an executive coach with over 20 years experience, and she was named to the prestigious 100 Coaches Group, which is the top executive coaches in the world. Wow. Her book, which I have read, is called The Seismic Shift in Leadership. And in it, she shares what she's learned in her years as an executive coach, primarily that connection with yourself, your team, and your organization is the key to a leader's success. And Michelle is joining us from her hometown of New Orleans. So again, it's great to have you here. I forgot to ask you before I started recording, how would you like me to refer to you? Is it Dr. Johnston, Michelle?
Oh, Michelle is great. Thank you, Sandy.
You got it. You got it. So I've told our listeners I've read your book, and to beat the big guys, you don't have to be the best leader in the world, but you do need some leadership skills. And fortunately, these skills can be learned. You don't have to be born with these. And thank goodness for people like Dr. Johnston and for books like The Seismic Shift in Leadership, where we today in this podcast in the next 20 minutes or so will learn some very usable and handy tools and tricks to help be the better leader that you can be. So now I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, and I can't wait to hear what she's going to say.
Great. Yeah, I don't think I ever had the goal necessarily to write a leadership book. But when I became an executive coach and I started seeing some of the leaders getting pushed out of organizations, of course, the question was why? Because the leaders who were getting pushed out of organizations, I was coaching some of them. And I wanted to know, what in the world could I do to be a better coach? And why is this leadership style not effective anymore? Because I'm age 53. I was brought up in that command and control style of leadership. All of my professors, all of my mentors. Yeah, I wish I could see raise of hands of the listeners. How many of us have had that command and control leader? Most of us have, right? And that was just how we were brought up. It was work harder, not necessarily smarter, put in the hours, prove yourself. It was much more of an authoritarian directive style. And so when I started seeing leaders get pushed out of an organization and get let go, I realized that the seismic shift, which is why I named the book The Seismic Shift, there was definitely a seismic shift happening. And two things. And then I realized that I could have been that leader, because when I first started out as a College of Business professor, I subscribed to that style. I looked around and the faculty members, my colleagues who were winning Faculty Member of the Year awards, they were very authoritarian and they were getting accolades under that style. And so I thought, well, then I want to be successful. I need to do the same thing. And so I squashed my inherent qualities, right? I knew myself to be kind of nurturing. I was pretty empathetic, pretty compassionate, but I thought, heck, that's not going to work, right? And so I kind of squashed those qualities and I became this authoritarian professor in the classroom. And guess what, Sandy? It didn't work. Surprise, surprise, it didn't work. So the gentlemen, and they were mostly older men that I was emulating, who were my mentors and again, my esteemed colleagues, and I really looked up to them. It worked because they were genuine. That was their personality. And they would, almost like drill sergeants, they would break the kids down and then build them back up. And the kids were like, this is amazing, right? But because it wasn't genuine on my part, I would walk in and I was pretending. And so people as humans, we pick up what fake is. We don't exactly know, but we can't necessarily articulate it, but we know something is off. And so when I realized that the seismic shift was happening and that that could have been me, I easily could have been asked to leave the university. They told me, they said, you need to improve your teaching evaluations. And I would go back to my dean and my associate dean and say, but how can I do that? I'm emulating what all of my colleagues are doing, but it's not working for me. And they kept trying to tell me to do this, do that, but it wasn't until years later, Sandy, that actually I remember vividly sitting in my colleague's office, Dr. Kendra Reed, and we were writing a paper. Of course, it's publish or perish. So I had my head down trying to publish as many articles as possible. And we were looking at the difference between high performing teams and low performing teams. And what was that differentiating factor? And this particular article, you're going to appreciate this, Sandy. This particular article said, the research found that the teams that performed the highest had at least one female on the team. And I remember just getting struck by this finding, and the authors didn't say exactly why. I mean, we can all assume, does everybody behave better? Do they use, their manners better with at least one woman on the team? I don't know why, but it definitely caused higher productivity. And for that particular day, me reading the article, and I'd been banging my head against the wall for years, trying to figure out how do I be the best professor I can be, I finally gave myself permission to be me. And to kind of own more of those feminine qualities that I had that I was trying to suppress. And so from there forward, and it was a big risk for me, I said, you know what, I've got to be myself. And it was finally when I connected with myself, and as you referred to, my story, who I was, what strengths I brought into the classroom. I read this book called The Art of Possibility by Ben Zander, and he was the conductor of the Boston Philharmonic Orchestra. And that particular book really changed my mindset, because he too had struggled with my teaching evaluations. As the conductor of an orchestra, he would go in and he would find fault and mistakes, and he was kind of aggressive about it. And what would happen is that his musicians ended up not performing at their best because he was so uber critical. He was really tough on himself. He was stressed out, and it created this orchestra that didn't play at its best. And so he went through some executive education series through Landmark Organization. I remember watching this video, Sandy, and he said he realized, my goodness, why don't I walk into the orchestra and see them all as stars and look at myself as the coach and how I can bring out the very best in my musicians? And he said it changed everything. Then all of a sudden, it wasn't a culture of fear. It was this culture of connection and support and positivity, and they could relax and play their best. And Sandy, I took that after I read that book, The Art of Possibility. I said, that's how I need to approach my students. I need to walk into the classroom and see them as A students. Mm-hmm. I need to recognize my strengths as a human is I'm a nurturer, right? I'm a supporter. I'm an encourager. Let's do that and see if I can create this environment of connection. And thankfully I did. And so I was able to turn my teaching evaluations around and get tenured and then get to this level I've been for 25 years. So I think when I started watching these executives fail who had been subscribing to what I thought had been successful and it wasn't, that's when I realized I needed to write the book. My sphere of influence at the time was only about 150 people in my orbit. And I said, I've got to get the message out and I've got to help more people. That command and control style does not work anymore.
So what's happened? Why not? What has something happened? Okay.
Yes, it's interesting is when I came to the conclusion that those leaders who were not successful were not connected with themselves. So my whole thesis in the seismic shift of leadership is that connection is the key. And the leaders who were getting pushed out were not connected with their team. Their team didn't trust them. But again, whenever I begin a coaching relationship, I conduct a 360. I've been mentored by Marshall Goldsmith. I am so fortunate. He's the #1 executive coach in the world, New York Times bestselling author. And he mentored me to begin every coaching relationship with a 360 feedback. So I go and I ask for the leader to give me 10 to 15 of their key stakeholders, and I interview all of them so that we can learn above, below, and around that particular leader, what they do well, what their blind spots are. And so I had this data book from all of their key stakeholders, all these leaders that I was coaching, and the data was telling me that their team didn't trust them. So the data didn't say the leader wasn't connected with themselves, right? Or the leader wasn't connected. It was the team members didn't trust the leader anymore. But when I went back and tried to interview more and say, what about this leader don't you trust? They would say, we can't really put our finger on it, but this leader's fake. And so that's when I realized that the lack of connection with your team is a result, a function of the lack of connection with yourself. In other words, these leaders were trying to be people they weren't. They were trying to be what success looked like to them, but they weren't genuine. So that's when I realized that it was all about connection. So this seismic shift, I mean, the millennials, absolutely. I mean, bravo to them. You know, they were the ones saying, I don't want to be treated like this anymore. I want to feel good about myself. I want to feel good about the organization that I work with. I want to be satisfied. And for some reason, I don't know why, in our generation, we're like, well, work is work, play is play, two very different things. You're not supposed to necessarily love your job, right? The benefit that you get is your paycheck. It just was a different orientation. And the millennials really pushed us to rethink. And particularly then the pandemic happens. And what we found with the great resignation, or what we call it as executive coaches, the great reorganization of values, the great reprioritization of your life. I mean, whatever you call it, the research has found that employees are quitting because A, they want flexibility, they want ownership of their calendar, and they want to be seen, heard, valued, and appreciated. And they don't want to work for jerk bosses anymore. A couple of months ago, I made a post on LinkedIn. I said, no more jerk bosses. We don't have the resilience coming out of a pandemic. We can't put up with that anymore. And so it's almost like this revolution, right? That we want higher quality work. We want environments that make us feel good. And again, I'm on a lot of radio shows, Sandy, recently promoting my book. And there always seems to be a caller calling in saying, Dr. Johnston, are you saying I hate this? Everybody gets a trophy. We're supposed to create this nice environment. And I said, wait, I'm not saying everybody gets a trophy, but I do think that we're all demanding that because we spend so much time at work, whether we're going to do it remotely or not, we want to feel seen, heard, appreciated, and valued. And there's nothing wrong with that. And it's about time.
I couldn't agree more. I bet you if we could somehow do a poll of everybody listening to this podcast, which is a nationwide podcast, and if you were to ask how many of you out there, raise your hand, have had at least one jerk boss, and maybe more, I bet everybody would raise their hand. And I don't think they're saying it just because it might have been their first job and they didn't know what a job was like. I mean, we understand what a jerk is. We all know what that is. And it's so true. It's so true. It used to be that way. All my bosses were jerks in my life. I'm sorry if you're listening to this podcast and just finding this out, but but in fact, my first boss, his name was Mr. Meanie, and he lived up to that name. But
that's hysterical. But yet I'm sorry for you, that you spent those years under jerk boss. I've got an example that relates to that, Sandy. Mm-hmm. I was just in San Diego a few weeks ago, one of my favorite clients, Qualcomm. And they keep asking me to come back to work with their teams because their whole motto is connectivity. And so here my whole thesis is about connection. So they're bringing all their people together, even though they're only requiring them to come in the office minimum of 2 days a week, Tuesdays and Wednesdays. They're spending a lot of money on these off-sites at these beautiful hotels, bringing all these people together, saying, because human connection matters, right? So I'm doing this Q&A, this fireside chat with the chief marketing officer, Don McGuire, who's just amazing. And one of the women, when there were questions at the end, she said, Michelle, She said, I had a boss. She said, thankfully, it's not one of the people here. I left that organization. She said, I had a boss that for 2 years during the pandemic never asked me once how I was doing. I was living alone. I was miserable. I was lonely. I was suffering. And he never once said, how are you doing?
Not even once.
Not even once in 24 months, she said. So I'd had enough. No more jerk bosses. I quit. Good. And I'm so happy to be at Qualcomm. But it also brings kind of tears to your eyes that there are still those bosses out there that are intent on not even seeing you as a human being. They just see you as the results you bring to the organization. And that has to change.
I agree 100%. Know it else. My daughter's first boss was a bona fide jerk, and it hurt me to watch her have to put up with this. But at least as a mother, I could be supportive during it, during what was happened. And we even encouraged her to leave. And it was a summer job during college, and we were very supportive of working. The children need to get a job, and they need to work. But her first boss was a real jerk, if I may use that word. So there's something else you mentioned that I just want to touch on, just because it's so interesting. Going back 40 years ago, when we were supposed to be authoritarian, and I even remember dressing more like a man.
Me too. Me too.
I would wear, and when I would soften it, I would wear a black suit and not a man's tie, but some sort of tie, and I would soften it with a rope of pearls. But that's it. That's the only feminine thing I did, is wear a rope of pearls on basically what was a man's suit crafted to look like a woman's suit, and I thought I was doing the right thing.
Well, we were twins, because I had an entire closet of black and tailored pantsuits with reasonable shoes. And what's really funny to me is, for years, my whole wardrobe was just black. It was easy. I tried to emulate more of that style. And now post-pandemic, Sandy, literally all I wear is hot pink, which makes me laugh, because this is intentional. I think that we need more pink in the world right now, a little bit more joy, a little bit more positivity. But I never would have worn hot pink back in those days. Never.
Interesting. My shirt looks orange in this video, in this Zoom, but it's actually hot pink. It is hot pink. The Zoom has a way of changing it. I'm a big hot pink lover. So there's so many things to talk about. I hope we have enough time. That I can't help but notice that the foreword of your book is by Marshall Goldsmith, and you referred to him a few minutes ago as the best. So what gave you the kahunas, for lack of a better word, the courage to write a book on the same subject as someone else who's already what you feel is the best? So why did you feel your book stood out and was different?
Yeah, it did take a lot of courage. You're absolutely right, on many different levels, because back in 2001, I read a New Yorker article that profiled and chronicled Marshall Goldsmith as an executive coach. It was the first time I'd ever heard of the language executive coach. I didn't know that there had been an occupation, a title, a role. And this reporter for the New Yorker followed Marshall around the world. And he was known back then as rehabbing jerk bosses. And he began with the stakeholder analysis, the 360, because oftentimes when you're really good at your job with results, you keep getting promoted. And so you have all this external validation. Well, I'm the, president of this division at this, Fortune 500 company, then why do I need to change? But what the stakeholder analysis does, which is what Marshall taught me, is it gives you all of the perceptions of the people who work with you, how they perceive you. And that's what you need to change, right? How other people perceive you. And it's typically not until these high-level leaders look at the 25 pages of data of how other people think that they're jerks. And sometimes Marshall even goes and interviews their family, and their wife thinks they're a jerk. Their kids think, and so it's when you see it in writing is when you typically have the person who says, whoa, I need to make some changes. And it's really tough reading that feedback. So in any case, this New Yorker article, I read it, and I wasn't tenured yet. I was a new faculty member. And I thought, one day, if I get a chance to be an executive coach, I literally ripped it out and it's still in my filing cabinet up at Loyola. I said, I'm going to follow Marshall Goldsmith's methodology. So fast forward years, and then I'm an executive coach and I'm coaching. I usually coach about 15 to 18 CEOs, and I'm in the audience of one of my biggest clients who had hired Marshall Goldsmith, who had just written a new book called Triggers, and he was on stage and he had just turned 70. I had never met the man, Sandy. I'd only had his article in my filing cabinet for years. So he's on stage, and I knew he was the #1 executive coach. I knew he was the #1 global thought leader. I knew he was a New York Times bestselling author. So he's on stage and he makes the announcement that he goes, it was just my birthday. I just turned 70. I have been so blessed. I don't need any more money. So I've decided that I'm going to pay it forward, and I want to give back, and I want to teach others how to coach others so that we can all be the very best versions of ourselves. If you're interested in having me as your mentor, please just let me know. So you can imagine, I raced home and sent Marshall an email. Hey, you don't know me, but that 2001 article completely inspired me. I follow your methodology. I know I'm not, fresh, brand new in this arena, but I certainly would love to learn from the best. Sincerely, Michelle Johnston. So that was over 3 years ago, and I got outwardly rejected. So yes, it took courage to even send that email, but months later, he sent me an email in return. He said, Michelle, thank you so much for reaching out. I was unprepared. I received 16,000 requests in 1 week. I was unprepared. So he said, why don't you circle back with me and let me kind of figure this out? So I circled back with him once I had my book written and it was off to the publisher. And I circled back. I said, hey, Marshall, it's Michelle Johnston. I now have a book. We definitely think similarly, although he hasn't written a book about connection. He certainly has written, I think, 45 books about leadership, but none of them were about connection, which was what differentiated mine. And so I said, would you please consider this time around being my mentor? And he immediately called when he received the email. It was during the pandemic. I was teaching from home. I had just taught my leadership class. In that class, I had just mentioned Marshall Goldsmith's name as somebody who had been not a mentor yet, but a real role model. So here my phone rings, I pick it up, and he said, Michelle, it's Marshall Goldsmith. I would love to mentor you. And
Wow.
it was really fantastic. And at that time, he invited me to be a part of the 100 coaches and and so I'm on these global calls every Monday morning, learning that connection not only is vital. I was worried that it was this American thing that I was seeing, this corporate thing I was seeing, that it's all about connection. Maybe it's not applicable around the world. Oh no, when I'm on these global calls with people from India and Russia and France and Spain, this is a global phenomenon. We are all craving meaningful connection.
We are. I'm so glad you mentioned that in getting the great Marshall Goldsmith, and you reached out, and it was difficult, but you did make a connection with him, and it did follow through. And for all of our listeners, it's okay to ask. Even if it seems impossible, you wonder, why am I even bothering? I'm going to talk about my book just for a second to prove that point. On the cover of my book is a testimonial from none other than the great Dave Eggers. And I actually hand wrote a note to Dave Eggers asking him, would he please write a testimonial or a blurb, what have you, for my book? And he did. And he wrote it back, and my publisher selected to put it on the cover of the book. It doesn't hurt to ask. It doesn't hurt to ask. And he wrote something very nice real quickly. He said, Sandy Rosenthal is a courageous and indefatigable warrior for justice, which I love. So in other words, if there's a connection, which there was between us, I took advantage of it just by asking. And so it's good for all of you to remember, just ask, because you can't do anything alone. Nothing can happen alone. Well, there's so many things we could talk about, but there is one that I really, really, really want to dig in a little bit deeper. It's something that you said on page 60. You said the magic word, feedback is a gift. Feedback is a gift. I think that is so true. And for so many reasons, it often comes at no charge. Okay. And I'll tell you something else. Know what else is a gift? And I'd like to throw this back to you, Michelle, is something that's similar, but is delivered a little differently. Criticism. I've always felt that criticism is a gift. Whenever I received criticism in my work, beating the big guys, I welcomed it and I would look for it. And I would be happy when I got it because I looked at that as a free, I didn't pay for it, advice that more often than not was good advice, that was excellent advice, and it made me smarter and better and more clever and more knew more, helped me know more. Criticism. So I'd like to, I mean, this is on page 60, and I read that chapter twice because I thought it was so good. So Michelle, enough about me talking. I hate when that happens. You are the guest. You're supposed to be talking. I'd like you to talk a little bit more about how feedback is a gift and also how criticism itself could also be a gift.
Absolutely. I remember going on stage after Warner Thomas, who's in my book. He's the CEO of Auctioner Health. And one of the things he was saying when he was delivering this town hall address to employees, he said, look, he said, I believe in leadership development. I'm investing a whole lot of resources and cash into leadership development for you all. If your boss in your annual evaluation says you're a high performer and we want to give you an executive coach, he said, take it and run. If you reach that level and we say, yes, you can have an executive coach, he said, I can't tell you how many people come to me and say, well, I mean, I'd like to learn how to be a better leader with an executive coach, but I'm too scared to go through the 360 feedback process because people are going to then know what my weaknesses are. And Warner on stage said to the whole audience, I'm here to tell you, everybody knows what your weaknesses are. Everybody knows them. And for you to keep running out of fear because other people are going to put it in writing, he said, feedback is a gift. And that's how you grow as a leader, is like welcome, you know. And I also do the feed forward. We call it, Marshall and I, feed forward, because when I interview these stakeholders to learn about this leader that I'm about to coach, I'm really not interested in so much of the mistakes in the past. The questions I ask are, what does success look like? How can this leader be even better? What are the leader's superpowers? Tell me what they do really well so I can help make sure they continue to doing those things. Too many people are wrapped up in what they don't do well. But the key as a coach is to make sure that my leaders are put in a position where they can succeed and excel, knowing their strengths and what they do really well. And then as a coach, making sure that we kind of smooth out maybe some of the rough edges, some of the blind spots that they're not aware of, make sure that they build a team that complements them. I heard a speaker once who said something that was so fascinating. She said, look, it's so much easier for me when I'm hiring to hire people exactly like me. I know you. I know how to manage you. I know how you see the world. She said, but that's not what I need. I need to surround myself with people who complement me and don't have my characteristics and strengths. It makes it harder, right, to manage those people, but that's what I need. So I think a coach makes sure that you continue doing what you're really good at and make sure that you can tweak some of the behaviors that are kind of getting in your way and make sure that you build a really solid team. So take on that. If you're offered an executive coach, take it. But please, that's what I want to tell your listeners. Don't be scared of feedback. Feedback is a gift.
Absolutely. We're about running out of time, but I don't want to let our listeners go without giving you what you feel is probably a final thing that you want to make sure that everybody hears today, just in case they don't have the opportunity to buy and read your book. What would you say?
Yeah, I think the tension that we're facing right now, post-pandemic, is people are telling us that they want to work from home. They want that flexibility, and yet we know we're all social humans, social creatures, and we crave human connection. So the question that's asked to me the most is, how in the world as leaders do we lead remotely, although we know everyone needs human connection? And here's what I've learned is that right now, as leaders, you need to embed personal connection in your operating rhythm. So what does that look like? If you have a weekly team meeting with 8 of your direct reports, don't just begin business as usual, because business is not as usual, and we're not putting the toothpaste back in the tube. Business is very different. The working world's very different, and you need to spend time meaningfully connecting with your people. So begin that team meeting. If it's an hour, begin 10 minutes with an opening question. Tell me about a high low. What can I do to kind of make your job easier this week? What's frustrating you the most? How are you doing really? Just begin with some sort of personal question that shows that you really care about your people at a more meaningful level. And last thing, I was just working with Salesforce, and they built a retreat center because they realized that although all their employees now, most of them, want to work from home, you have to have face-to-face meaningful connection to collaborate and get the results you want for a business. So they're embedding time to go to these retreats and really focus on face-to-face team building. They also focus on well-being. They do yoga, they do meditation, but they spend time together as a team, psychological safety, trust. So just know that as a leader, if you really want to get those business results that you need, make sure you embed time for meaningful connection.
Thank you so much. I for those of you that would like to do this, the Seismic Shift in Leadership by Michelle Johnston, I highly recommend it. It's very readable. And I learned so many new things from it. I thought I knew everything, but I definitely learned a lot reading this book, and I highly recommend it. Thank you again, Michelle Johnston. And I hope all of you enjoyed this episode. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on all of your favorite platforms. And remember, no matter who you are, you can beat the big guys.
Thank you so much, Sandy. Take care. Thanks for listening.
Oh, I didn't mean to hit end. I hit the wrong button. 1 second. Okay, 1 second. I meant to stop recording.